Да, да. Добрый
Good afternoon, good morning, dear colleagues. I welcome you all to the Multimedia Press Center of Россия Сегодня news agency, and I'm very glad to welcome our distinguished guests here. Today we have parliamentarians, members of parliament from both Russia and Great Britain. We have a video conference between Moscow and London. We will be discussing 2016 development in trends in global politics and their long-term effects. So we're very proud to have members of parliament from both Russia and from the UK, and unfortunately there is no parliamentary cooperation group between the two parliaments, and we will make our thus contribution to promoting bilateral dialogue in London. Here with us we have a member of parliament in the House of Commons from the Scottish National Party, Mr. Paul Monaghan, and in Moscow, Mr. Igor Morozov, member of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation. Mr. Morozov, so a brief statement to you. Mr. Monaghan, I'm happy to welcome you at this video conference. It is a great pleasure that after a long break in the contacts and the dialogue between the senators of Russia and the British Parliament, we're able to interact in this video conference, and we have this opportunity to discuss the key issues in today's politics that will, of course, influence international relations in 2017. So I would like our discussion to be very sincere, very open, regardless of whether we like the questions we will be discussing. We have to restore dialogue. A lot depends on it. We all live in Europe. Our countries have great influence over global politics, have a great international role. And we have seen in the second half of 2016 new trends emerge, that there is no doubt that these trends will influence both national interests of our countries. So I propose that we discuss all these issues. Thank you so much, Mr. Morozov. So the first question to Mr. Monaghan. In the British referendum in June, Brexit supporters won. And a lot of politicians believe that Brexit, of course, will have a lasting impact on the EU and the whole world, and of course for Great Britain. Will Scotland leave the UK following the Brexit? There are discussions about a new referendum within the next 2 years about Scotland's place in the UK. So you represent Scotland. Why is it so important for Scotland to remain an EU member?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much indeed for the warm welcome and invitation to speak with you today. I absolutely agree that it's important that the people of Scotland and the people of Russia and their parliamentarians are in an active and sincere dialogue, and I hope very much to be a part of that. You've asked about Brexit. I think it's important to say, first of all, that the people of the UK did not vote uniformly in favour of leaving the EU. As you've alluded to, the people of Scotland in particular voted to stay within the EU. The people did that because the European Union is very important to us. Specifically, access to the single market is crucial for our economy. Free movement of people is vital to many of our industries, including agriculture and academia. And our EU citizenship is important to those of us who choose to travel around the EU or to live in other parts of the EU, or indeed who have family members who come from the rest of the EU. So Scottish politicians in particular are very active at this point in time, trying to negotiate with the UK government to make sure that Scotland's position and all of the opportunities that the EU represents to us are sustained and maintained for the future. We want our relationship with the EU to be an enduring one, not a short-term one, and we are committed to that. You've asked specifically about a referendum. That's not our starting point. Our starting point, as I've said, is to protect our place in the EU. The UK government has said very clearly that it's prepared to listen to the people of Scotland and to ensure that our views are taken into account as the Brexit negotiations develop. And we are going to hold them to account on that promise. We want our views to be heard, we want our views to be listened to, and we want them to be properly addressed. We want our position in the EU to be sustained and maintained, as I've said. If the UK government chooses not to listen to the people of Scotland, then it might very well be that the people of Scotland decide to take the matters into their own hand and to exercise their right to self-determination again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monaghan. Mr. Morozov, can we expect any major changes in the EU after the Brexit, after the referendum that took place in Italy? The Prime Minister had to resign over its result, and well, of course, the incoming Prime Minister was a minister in the previous government, so we do not expect any major changes. But overall, how the changing situation in the EU can affect the relations between Russia and the EU, Russia and Great Britain? Well, I think that the relations between Russia and Great Britain are very important because they have a major influence on how we fight international terrorism, how Russia counters and addresses other threats as drug trafficking, non-proliferation of WMDs, migration flaws. Today in the Federation Council we have a session and we discuss the achievements that we have been able to attain and the issues we have been able to avoid in Russia, unlike the EU. This means that parliamentarians have what they need to regulate migrant flows in their countries and to remain attractive in economic terms for attracting workforce, and while not committing any violations in terms of migration, so that the migration flows do not affect ordinary people. So today we're fighting international terrorism in Syria. And the Russian Federation and the coalition that is led by Russia wants and has achieved substantial success and the Syrian army, the Syrian government troops that are fighting to maintain the statehood and territorial integrity and ensure sovereignty of their country, these troops are on the ground and they are fighting for themselves, not for somebody else. And of course, the liberation of Aleppo is a strategic victory for the coalition and for the Syrian army specifically, and of course it will have a major impact on the whole military operation and campaign and will have a major influence on political trends because the opposition, including people who are outside Syria, they are ready to launch talks with the Syrian government. They are ready to talk to Assad, and this is very important, very much important, because we believe that in any country, people themselves should be able to resolve the issue the country is facing, and Russia has always said that it is against third-party interference into domestic affairs of a sovereign state. So it was very strange for us to see in the UN Security Council the meeting that was initiated by the United States and by Great Britain, and they condemned the final stage in the liberation of Aleppo. We saw how civilians welcomed the army that when it entered the liberated districts of Aleppo. We see that the Center for Humanitarian Aid that Russia has set up is delivering humanitarian aid. And then we see this initiative by Great Britain and by the US in the UN Security Council. What was said in this meeting runs counter to the actual events on the grounds in Aleppo. So this is very strange for us. We thought that we must come together to address this major challenge, new challenge for the international community, and to join ranks in defeating terrorism so that we are not exposed to the terrorist attacks as we saw in Paris, in Brussels, in Nice, or other European cities. Defeating international terrorism that is now focused in Syria is a common challenge for us, and we must stand united in addressing this issue. And I have a question I wanted to ask. Is it possible that there will be a shift in Great Britain within the British government to review their position on Russia's participation in the Syrian conflict? Could we think of a single front against international terrorism? Mr. Monaghan, Mr. Morozov has just asked you a question. He wanted to ask you whether we can have more understanding between Russia and your country on fighting international terrorism. We do not want the Syrian issue to divide us. We want it to unite us.
I think many important comments have just been highlighted there by my colleague in Russia. I think it's vitally important that the people of the UK, particularly Scotland, as my interest represents, and the people of Russia are talking together, are in a dialogue, and they are fighting terrorism, and they are united in that respect. I think the situation in Syria is one that is best described as a humanitarian disaster. Here in the UK, people see on the TV and on social media every single day the dreadful situation of individuals, families, children, old people experiencing significant hardship, loss of life, injury, and maiming in Syria. When the UK Parliament voted on this particular issue earlier this year, I voted against the UK becoming involved in bombing in Syria. My party and I were in a minority and we lost that vote. So immediately the UK government did start a bombing programme. I think that was very regrettable. I would much rather have seen them join a significant humanitarian effort to help the people of Syria, the people of Aleppo in particular, and to start challenging the role of terrorist agencies and groups in that particular region of the world. I do think it's important that people of the world have a full and open insight into what is actually happening in Syria. I think often media misrepresent the situation, they misrepresent the approach of various governments around the world, and many people, perhaps particularly in the UK, do not understand what the roles of all of the various countries involved in this conflict are. I think we need to work very hard to try to improve understanding in that respect, and I think that that responsibility falls on all of the countries that are currently involved in military action in that particular region of the world. And it's important that we also place a very heavy emphasis on humanitarian aid and making sure that the so-called collateral damage that is incurred and endured by the people of Syria whilst fighting terrorists is absolutely minimised, if not completely eradicated. So I support the comments that have been made. Let's enter a dialogue, but let's be very, very challenging about what is happening in Syria, and let's place the emphasis on supporting the people and making sure that they have a viable economy and a viable life in their country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monaghan. Mr. Morozov, our UK colleague has mentioned the media, and there was a recent media report that US analysts believe that a conflict between Russia and NATO is one of the major threats for 2017. This conflict may result from aggressive Russian actions in Eastern Europe, but it is not NATO that is approaching Russian borders and deploying their missile defense systems in this region. What is your take on this issue? We discuss a lot the NATO infrastructure approaching the Russian borders, and we believe that the political and military leadership of NATO has chosen a tactic of approaching its infrastructure to the Russian border. I'm talking about command points, about ammunition warehouses, and all the other infrastructure. We know that they are located in Bulgaria, in Romania, in the Baltic states, in Poland, and in 2017 they will launch the deployment of up to 1,000 people in these countries. So, as a person with a military background, I see that there are all signs that they're preparing an offensive operation. And NATO does not tell us that we do not make any similar steps. We must not repeat what happened in the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, when Russia entered the Second World War in June 1941, when we did not have the military infrastructure in place on our western borders, and we were exposed to an attack by the Germans. We cannot afford to have such a precedent one more time in 2017 or in the 21st century in general. Another threat that we see is the missile defense system deployed by the US. The first perimeter has already been launched in Romania, and the second one is in the pipeline. It is being created in Poland. So Russia cannot fail to respond to these developments, because we understand that modern warfare, a war in today's world, will be very brief. All sides have very powerful weapons, hypersound weapons that can operate at huge speeds, for example, up to 18,000 kilometers per second. So it's and even there are even faster types of missiles. So there is no trust between Russia and NATO. It was destroyed. So in terms of dialogue, parliamentarians, members of parliament should take center stage, because the parliamentarians, it is their job to speak to each other, and we must speak in the Parliamentary Assembly of this Council of Europe and within the OSCE, and to use other international platforms of interparliamentarian cooperation. The situation is very challenging, very alarming. There is huge lack of trust, and we are approaching this abyss, and we need to look from both sides, and to look down into this abyss, and to understand what can happen, because once a conflict starts, it will be too late to go back. A war, we should prevent any future war. We have lived through 2 world wars, and both your country, the United Kingdom, and Russia, we have suffered a lot of destructions and the death of millions of people. I would now like to pass the floor to London and to hear a comment from our British guests, our Scottish guests. You represent a NATO country, so what is your perspective on the forecasts by US analysts whether Russia is really a threat in next year?
I don't believe that Russia is a threat to the UK or in fact to Europe, and equally I don't believe it's realistic or plausible for NATO to launch any kind of offensive mission against the Russian Federation. That would be absolutely deplored by all politicians, I think, in the UK, and indeed many politicians around the EU. I think it's important that the people of Russia understand that the people of Scotland, and indeed most of the people of the UK, look towards Russia as a partner, as a country that's important geographically, and as a country that's important to the future of the world in terms of developing shared objectives and a shared economy. We want to be working with the people of Russia, not fighting them. It's interesting that the situation in the 1940s in Europe has been highlighted. I think it's important that we remember the tragic events of the Second World War. It's important that we remember that Russia was a key ally in that fight, and it's important that we remember that the EU largely exists today because it was established to make sure that peace in Europe was an enduring feature of the relationships of countries in this part of the world. Another reason, I think, why the SNP, my political party, is against Brexit. But coming back to the point, I think we do need to make every possible effort to make sure that the situation in Russia is understood in the UK and in the US, and equally that the situation in the US, the UK, and indeed within NATO is fully understood in Russia. I'm a big believer in dialogue. I go out of my way to speak to people around the world who are involved in conflicts, both sides. I try not to be judgmental, but I do try to work very hard to make sure that there is a realistic understanding and that the opportunities of working together are realised and that we don't descend into fighting. I think it's absolutely correct to say that if there is a third world war, it will be a very, very short one, and it will result in the end of civilization as we know it. I'm against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I do not support the UK having nuclear weapons simply because I know that their use would result in the end of the world as we know it today. So let's work together to make sure that that does not become a possibility. And I would hold out the hand of friendship today to my colleague in Moscow and say to him, let's you and I work together. Let's form that inter-parliamentary liaison group that has been talked about. Let's make sure that it happens, and let's make sure that together colleagues from Scotland and in the UK and in Russia are working together directly to make sure that we understand what is going on and that we have a dialogue so that we can challenge the myths and challenge the misrepresentations that are often perpetrated for no good reason and certainly for no good will. So let's work together, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Monaghan. Another factor that will be very important for the agenda in 2017, this will be the so-called factor of the new president in the United States. So this is the so-called Trump factor. He is now the president-elect. So, Mr. Morozov, there is a lot of reports in the media about the new administration, how it is formed. It has yet to be approved by the Senate, so we cannot be sure who will have what position. And a lot of senators in the United States have said that some members of the next administration they are pro-Russian. So do you think that this Russian factor in US politics, will it have any effect on the transition process in the United States and how people, what people will be appointed? Maybe the Senate will turn down some of the candidates for major positions. Well, I always thought that we, the Slavic peoples, given our religious background, our mentality, and our general mindset, we can look any situation look better than it is. We have a tendency to exaggerate something when we want something, but sometimes the US senators also engage in wishful thinking. If we look at the team proposed by the president-elect Donald Trump, for the key positions from Steve Brennan, Michael Flynn, James Mattis, we do not see any pro-Russian politicians. This is the way it is. If we're talking about Michael Flynn, for example, he is a very serious military intelligence officer who has a long track record in the Marine Corps, and his statements, at least on Twitter, there is no sign in these statements, in these posts, that he will be a pro-Russian member of the U.S. administration, and he will be a national security advisor, by the way. We see that he believes in the exclusive nature of the United States. We see that what he says about the Middle East, and he sees the Middle East as a threat for the civilized world, and nowhere can we find any statements about Russia that the U.S. needs to improve its relations with Russia, to have more trust with Russia. If we are speaking about James Mattis, who could become the head of the Pentagon, he has served for all his life in the U.S. Army, and he fought in almost all the conflicts where the U.S. was involved, so it is not a coincidence that he was called as a wild dog by his colleagues, and he has a very harsh position towards the Arab world, where we see a very serious regional conflict right now, and he has never said that the Pentagon in 2017 will have to change its position towards Russia. So instead of strengthening the military influence of the US in Europe, it will act otherwise. So he has never said that. He has never said that the US should not allocate more funding to countering Russian hostile propaganda. And by the way, they've allocated $3 billion for this purpose. All he speaks about is about how unique is the United States. He speaks about rearming the army and the navy. So this is what we hear from Mattis. So I'm not sure that we will see any pro-Russian members of the incoming administration. This new team is focused on the national interests of the United States, and this is quite understandable. But the question is whether we will be able to agree that national interests, if it's your priority, if it's a priority also for Russia, that they do not contradict and do not evolve and translate into border conflicts in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in Ukraine, or in other places. So we need to understand this right now, how we will work with this new team. Of course, we want to improve our relations. The Russian president had said so. We have been saying so in the Senate. There is no doubt that we want to promote dialogue, parliamentary dialogue, diplomatic dialogue, and to discuss the key issues of international politics. So, Mr. Morozov, I have not mentioned one of the candidates, Rex Tillerson, who is the candidate for Secretary of State. So he's seen as the most pro-Russian candidate. He's believed to have close ties with the Russian leadership, and ExxonMobil, the company he heads, the company always followed the sanctions against Russia. So the factor of a person who knows Russia and who could become the Secretary of State will it be a disadvantage for him? Well, yes, maybe, because there is a lot of competition for this position of Secretary of State, and there is a lot of political struggles going on right now, and of course his opponents will use this, but this does not mean anything for Russia. The fact that he worked in Russia, yes, it is true. He was a manager here, a top executive in Russia. He has an understanding of Russia. He knows Russians, but this is what Trump said. This echoes his position. He is ready to talk to Putin. He is ready to make deals with Putin. But this does not mean that he will be able to change the political trend in a radical way with all this legislation that comes from the Congress, and so it will be very hard for Trump to end this vicious circle, and for doing so, this has to be backed in Congress in order to cancel sanctions against Russia, in order to stop providing weapons to Ukraine, to the moderate Syrian opposition. So all the things that were done by the Obama administration will remain in place. We do not see any political group on the other side that will be ready to improve relations with Russia. Thank you so much, Mr. Morozov. I would now like to turn once again to Mr. Monaghan. Great Britain is one of the closest allies for the United States. A new president and this Trump factor, will it have any impact on your country?
I think the election of Mr. Trump has already had an impact in the UK and indeed around the world. My own personal perspective would be that what we are seeing at this point in time in many of the Western democracies is a fairly significant shift to the political right. Along with that comes a degree of intolerance, and it comes with a particular focus on aspects of the economy that perhaps aren't always helpful. The impact on social programmes also is not constructive. My view is that the people of America were probably voting for change at the presidential elections which they've just had, in a very similar way to the Brexit vote in June here in the UK. Many people, I think, are struggling financially. Families are finding it difficult to make ends meet, and amidst all of that personal hardship is some political turmoil. As I've suggested, people vote for change. In America, that has resulted in the election of Mr. Trump. And I think it's important that we remember that often the President of the United States, whilst clearly a significant and powerful individual on the world stage, does not always have the influence to be able to change policies and to be able to undertake actions to deliver against the promises that they might have made during their presidential campaign. In this particular case, of course, the Republican Party in the US not only now will have the presidency, but also controls the House of Representatives and the Senate. That does put the Republican Party and Mr. Trump in quite a strong position, but it doesn't mean that he has unfettered powers to do as he pleases around the world. Mr. Trump, I think, will find that his powers are qualified, that they are in some respects tempered, and that it is required of him to talk to other countries and enter dialogue. Here in the UK, we are hearing that Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin have had conversations, that there is the possibility of them developing a working relationship. Personally, I would view that as a positive outcome. The media here in the UK, certainly parts of the media here in the UK, are presenting that as being problematic and an objective that they wouldn't want to see realised. Fundamentally, of course, what we all need to be doing, as we've said several times during this interview, is talking to one another, understanding each other's positions, and trying to reach agreements and accommodations so that we can all move forward together in the best possible way. It remains to be seen, I think, whether that will be achievable with some of the senior members of the US government when it comes into power. But we shall have to watch that with great interest and, I think, make a determined effort to engage with some of those individuals to make sure that we achieve things for the best rather than achieve things for the worst. So again, a very good example of why we need to be working with other people, making an effort to understand their own political perspectives, and also to recognise that in realpolitik it is not often up to an individual to make dramatic decisions, and I think nowhere more does that apply than in the United States.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you so much. Now let's turn to a Q&A to our journalists present here. If you have any questions, we are short on time, so yes, we have a question here. Introduce yourself and ask your question. I have a question to Mr. Monaghan. I represent International Life magazine. My question is about the political role of the United Kingdom after Brexit. Until the mid-20th century, the UK was a global power and it became a regional power after entering the EU. What will be the future of Great Britain after the Brexit?
The influence and the role of the UK on the world stage is a diminishing one. I think the Brexit vote and the approach of the UK government is now to isolate the UK in the world. Clearly that's not very helpful in terms of developing relationships and developing influence. I think we're already seeing a significant erosion of the relationship between the UK and the US, for example. So it's a diminishing influence. It's a dramatically different situation to that which was in place 50 years ago. And I think that the UK government is making a grave error if it believes that it can leave the EU and continue to be a major influence on world politics. The two simply do not go together.
У вас есть вопрос?
Any question? Other questions? Even if a person has to choose between two evils, of course, many choose the evil in the end of the day. Maybe we have to look at what brings us together. Your birthday is December 8th, and Mr. Morozov's birthday is December 10th. Maybe we should look at what brings us together and not what separates us. 10 years of negotiations are better than one day of war. You've said that Trump has a little chance to be the most powerful person on earth. He will not be able to do everything he wishes. If you imagine an alien coming to Earth and asks you who is the boss on Earth, so who would you present this alien to? So this is a question to Mr. Monaghan. Mr. Morgan, please.
Consider to be the leader of the free people on the planet Earth. I dread to think what an alien would think of the world at this point in time. I don't think there is a natural leader now in the world. I think an alien would find it very difficult to enter a dialogue with any individual or perhaps even any group that would represent everybody on the planet at this point in time. I think that perhaps highlights a deficiency in the role of the United Nations. Personally, I would like to see the United Nations exert more of an influence on world politics and take a more robust line with countries when they are engaged in conflicts that are not helpful or conducive to world peace. The United Nations, I think, could have a prominent role in the world. It doesn't appear to be particularly effective. It appears to be overly bureaucratic, and I think that that's perhaps an area that all governments in the world, but particularly the 5 that are on the UN Security Council, should really start to consider how they improve that relationship. So an alien, I think, is in for a difficult time if it comes to the planet Earth, unfortunately, but I'm sure that we would learn a great deal from that species, and that we should try to work together, as you've suggested, to find the common links between nations and develop those aspects where we can agree and where we can do something constructive together.
Господин Монаган, и все-таки с вашей...
So, Mr. Monaghan, what could improve the relations between Russia and Great Britain, Russia and the EU, and between Russia and the Euro-Atlantic community in general?
The answer to that question is an easy one. It's dialogue. We need to be talking to one another. We need to be meeting together. We need to be facing the challenges that we identify, and we need to be challenging misinformation and misrepresentations. Relatively simple. Let's speak together. When we stop speaking, when we stop communicating, that's when we find difficulties, and that's when problems seem to grow. So again, I would hold out the hand of friendship with the people of Russia and with parliamentarians in Russia. Let's start talking, let's start working together, and let's start trying to make sure that peace endures and that we build a better world together.
Игорь Николаевич.
Mr. Morozov, I think that what lies ahead is the year 2017 that must put an end to the confrontation that was initiated, that we saw after 2014, and we need to start talking to each other, at least bilaterally, just like me and you right now. After conversations like this one, we get a better insight in our mutual positions. We can go to parliamentary assemblies. Russia has always been saying that we need to talk to each other in the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. All the contacts that were severed, all this leads to more distrust in our relations and makes it impossible for us to understand each other. And what results from it is an information war that tries to affect public opinion in our countries. So we have to put an end to all these negative developments. I hope that the British Parliament and our colleagues from all the other European countries will support the restoration of the powers of the Russian delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This will be a first step for restoring our dialogue. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to end our video conference there. Thank you so much, Mr. Monaghan, Mr. Morozov. We will be happy to see you once again in our multimedia center, even if we have to talk over video conference. This is also great dialogues. Thank you so much, Mr. Monaghan. We'll be happy to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.